July 1885. The Mojave Desert. Not a soul for miles. A lone cowboy is pushing north through 110-degree heat, 3 days in, tired to the bone, when a scream tears through the silence and stops him cold. A woman, alone, in the middle of nowhere, about to bring a child into the world with nothing but the desert floor beneath her. He had supplies to deliver. He had places to be. He could have kept riding. But something deep inside him said, "Stop." And that one decision changed 2 lives forever. Welcome. This channel is home to stories from the heart of the Old West, tales of weathered cowboys with tender hearts, of love that grows in the most impossible places, of mothers who fight with everything they have, and of strangers who become family. Because out on the frontier, the thing that made people truly strong was never just their grit, it was their willingness to care. This story reminds us that your greatest blessings in life may be waiting on the other side of a moment when you choose to stop. Not because someone asked you to, not because you had the time, but simply because it was right. If this story moved something in you, give it a like. It only takes a second, but it truly means the world. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
That scream just ripped right through the quiet of the desert, and Wade Emerson yanked his horse back so hard that a big old cloud of dust boiled up around him. It took a good long while for it to settle back down on the dry earth. It was July of 1885, and the Mojave Desert wasn't in a forgiving mood for any living thing. The sun was hanging up there like a blast furnace, and Wade had been pushing hard for 3 straight days out of Skidoo, California. He was hauling supplies to a mining camp about another day north. He was only 26, but life had weathered him something fierce. Still, that sound made his blood run cold in a way the heat never could. That was the sound of a woman in real trouble. Wade nudged, his buckskin mare on, his eyes searching the trail up ahead. The path twisted through rock formations that stuck up out of the desert floor like a mouthful of busted teeth. Somewhere in those rocks, a person needed help, and they needed it bad. Another cry told him which way to go, and he spurred his horse into a run, forgetting all about the tricky ground and the supply bags tied on his saddle. He found her crumpled up next to a creosote bush, the only patch of shade for miles, and it wasn't hardly big enough to cover her. She was a young woman, maybe 23 or so, with dark red hair stuck to her sweaty face. Her dress was soaked clear through, and when she looked at him, Wade could see plain as day the fear and grit fighting in her green eyes. "Help me," she breathed out before another pain grabbed hold of her, choking off the rest of her words. Wade was off his horse in a flash, his mind turning over what to do and coming up empty. He'd helped birth a calf or 2 in his time, but a person's child was a whole different story, and this woman was all by herself on a desert trail with no wagon, no horse, nothing but a little bundle lying a few feet from where she'd fallen. "How long's it been like this?" he asked, getting down on one knee beside her, trying to keep his voice calm. "Hours," she got out between heavy breaths. "My husband, we were going to my sister's in Barstow. The wagon wheel busted yesterday. He went to find help. He told me to wait, but the baby just wouldn't." Her voice cracked on that last part, and tears cut little trails through the dust on her cheeks. "He should have been back. Something must have happened to him, I just know it. So I started walking. I couldn't just sit there all alone. But the pains got real bad, and I couldn't go no more." Wade scanned the empty horizon stretching out in every direction. The closest town was Skidoo, a full day's hard ride back the way he came. Barstow was 2 days on to the northeast. There wasn't any help coming, no doctor to fetch, and no experienced women to take over. It was just him, this scared woman, and a baby who was on its way, ready or not. "What's your name?" he asked, already untying the bedroll from behind his saddle. "Rebecca," Rebecca Garrett. She grabbed his arm when another wave of pain hit, her fingers digging in so tight they'd surely leave a mark. "Please, don't you leave me out here." "I'm not going anywhere," Wade said, his voice steady as he spread his bedroll on the ground to give her a cleaner place to lie. "My name is Wade Emerson, and I'm going to help you with this. You hear me, Rebecca? You're not alone now." She gave a little nod, and some of the wild fear in her eyes seemed to settle down, though she was still breathing fast and hard. Wade took his canteen and knelt by her side again, helping her take a sip. The water was warm from the desert sun, but it was wet, and she drank it down like she was dying of thirst. "All right, we need to get you onto this bedroll," Wade said, getting himself in position to help her. "Reckon you can move?" Rebecca nodded and let him ease her from the hard dirt onto the blanket he'd laid out. The effort brought on another pain, a whole lot stronger than the last one, and she cried out, grabbing a fistful of Wade's shirt. He held on to her, saying whatever soft words came to mind, though his own heart was beating so loud he could barely think straight. When it passed, Rebecca fell back, completely worn out. Her dress was bunched up around her knees, soaked with sweat and other fluids Wade didn't care to look at too close. He didn't know the first thing about this, had no training, just a gut feeling and the faint idea that babies had been getting born for thousands of years without any doctors around. People had made it this far, so it had to be possible to get through it, even out here in the middle of nowhere with just a cowboy and a whole lot of grit to see it through. "How far apart are they coming?" Wade asked, trying to pull up anything he'd ever heard about birthing a baby. "Close," Rebecca gasped out. "So close. I think it's coming soon." Wade swallowed hard and nodded. He went to his saddlebag and pulled out a clean shirt, the only extra one he had. It would have to do for wrapping up the baby when it got here. He also took out his knife and cleaned it real good with some whiskey from his flask, remembering an old-timer once telling him that being clean was important when you're bringing a new life into the world. The next pain hit her before he was ready, and Rebecca's scream bounced off the rocks all around them. Wade rushed to her side, and she latched onto his hand, squeezing so hard he thought his bones might snap. He let her hold on, giving her something solid to fight against while her body did its work. "You're doing real good," Wade said, his voice all gravelly with feelings he hadn't known were in him. "You're a strong woman, Rebecca. Stronger than you even know." "I'm scared," she whispered, when the pain let up enough for her to talk. "I don't want to die out here. I don't want my baby to die." "You're not gonna die," Wade said, sounding a lot more sure than he felt. "And neither is your baby, I give you my word." He had no idea if he could keep that promise, but he said it all the same. She needed to hear it, and Lord knows he needed to believe it. The other way of thinking was just too terrible to consider. The pains started coming one right after another, with barely a minute to breathe in between. Rebecca was crying and pushing, her face flushed red from the strain, her whole body working at the impossible job of bringing another person into the world. Wade moved himself to where he could see, though the sight of it all made his stomach twist up with a mix of fear and wonder. "I can see the head," he said, his voice trembling no matter how hard he tried to keep it steady. "Rebecca, the baby's coming. You gotta push with the next one." She nodded, too tired to say a word. And when the pain came, she bore down with every last bit of strength she had. Wade cupped his hands and supported the baby's head as it came out, so impossibly tiny and covered in blood and slickness. He'd never seen anything like it, never felt the weight of a new life in his own 2 hands. "Again," he urged her. "One more good push." Rebecca let out a raw cry of pure effort, and the baby's shoulders slid free. Wade caught the infant as it entered the world, a slippery, warm little thing that felt both delicate and like a miracle. The baby let out a tiny, reedy cry that was still strong, and Wade felt his own eyes start to sting as he gently wiped the little one's face and mouth with a corner of his shirt. "It's a boy," he said, his voice all thick with emotion. "You've got a son, Rebecca." She was crying too, reaching out for her baby with trembling hands. Wade helped her get the little fella situated on her chest. Mother and son just looked at each other for the first time while Wade tied off and cut the cord with his clean knife, working slow and careful, trying not to think about how badly things could have gone. But the baby was breathing. Rebecca was breathing. And for right now, that was more than enough. Wade wrapped his spare shirt around the baby to keep him warm, though the desert heat made that feel a little bit silly. He helped Rebecca get more comfortable and gave her more water, watching as she held her newborn son with a look of pure wonder and exhaustion on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes full of a gratitude so deep he couldn't rightly put a name to it. "You saved us." "You did all the hard work," Wade said, sitting back on his heels and swiping the sweat from his own brow. His hands had started shaking now that it was all over, the adrenaline draining out of him and leaving him feeling empty and strange. They stayed right there in the shade of that creosote bush as the sun started its long, slow journey down. Wade kept watch, his rifle laid across his lap, just in case any critters or trouble showed up. Rebecca drifted in and out of sleep with the baby resting on her chest, and Wade found himself just watching him. There was an odd sort of tightness in his chest he couldn't quite figure out. He'd been on his own for so long. After his folks died from a fever when he was 18, he just drifted from one town to the next, picking up work where he could and never putting down roots. It was easier that way, a whole lot simpler. But looking at Rebecca and her new son, he felt something give way inside him, like a door he'd kept bolted shut for years was suddenly cracking open. When Rebecca finally stirred, the shadows were getting long, and the mean old heat of the day was finally starting to back off. She looked around, confused for a second, then looked down at the baby in her arms. A wave of pure relief washed over her face as, even though she'd worried it was just a dream or worse that they hadn't made it through after all. "How are you feeling?" Wade asked, his voice low. "Tired," she confessed, "and sore. But I'm alive." She took a breath, then looked right at him. "My husband, he surely should have returned by now." Wade gave a slow nod. He'd been thinking the exact same thing. A man doesn't just leave his pregnant wife by herself in the desert unless he's got no other choice. And if he'd gone to fetch help, he ought to have been back long before this. That could only mean something had gone terribly wrong, and Wade wasn't about to say those things out loud, with Rebecca looking so frail and exhausted. "We need to get you to a safe place," Wade said instead. "Are you able to travel?" Rebecca glanced down at her newborn, then her eyes met Wade's again. "I do not reckon I have much of a choice." Wade nodded and got to his feet, walking over to his horse. The buckskin mare was a well-behaved and patient animal, still standing right where he had left her all those hours ago. He started unloading some of his gear, shifting the weight around to clear a space for Rebecca and the baby. It meant he'd have to leave behind some of the goods he was being paid to haul. But that felt like nothing compared to the lives hanging in the balance right here. He fashioned a rough sling out of his bedroll, making a carrier Rebecca could wear to keep the baby nestled against her chest, leaving her hands free. Getting her up on the horse was the next hurdle. She was weak from giving birth, her legs unsteady and trembling, but Wade took her weight and hoisted her up, gently as he knew how, onto the saddle. "You hold tight to that horn," he told her, adjusting the stirrups so her feet could find a comfortable rest. "I'm going to lead the horse. We'll take it nice and slow." Rebecca nodded, with one arm wrapped securely around the baby in the sling, and the other hand gripping the saddle horn for dear life. Wade took the reins and started the long walk south, back in the direction of Skidoo. It would likely take them 2 days going at this pace, maybe even longer, but it was the nearest town. Rebecca needed a real doctor, good food, rest, and a safe roof over her head. They trekked through the evening and on into the night, with Wade navigating by the stars and the dim light of a shrinking moon. Rebecca dozed off in the saddle, and the gentle rocking of the horse seemed to soothe the baby and keep him quiet. Wade just kept on walking, his legs aching and his eyes stinging from being so tired, but he refused to stop. Every single mile they put between themselves and that empty piece of desert felt like a small win. When the first light of dawn painted the desert pink and gold, Wade finally declared a rest. Rebecca needed to get some proper sleep, and the little one needed to nurse. Wade helped her down from the horse and laid out his last blanket for her to sit on. He built a small fire and made some coffee with the provisions he had left. It was strong and bitter, but it was hot, and Rebecca took the cup with a grateful look. "Tell me about your husband," Wade said. It was not because he was particularly curious, but because Rebecca looked like she desperately needed to talk, to give a voice to the fear that had been building up in her eyes with each hour that went by. "His name was Thomas," Rebecca said in a low voice, staring down into her coffee cup. "We met in Sacramento 2 years back. He was a good man, dependable and kind. When I learned I was expecting, he wanted to get me to somewhere safer than those mining camps we'd been living in. My sister, she married a rancher down near Barstow, and Thomas figured I could stay with her until the baby was born." She paused, her voice cracking. "We were so very close. Just another day, maybe 2. And then that wagon wheel broke and the whole world just fell to pieces." Wade heard how she used the past tense when talking about Thomas, and he knew right then she had already faced the truth she couldn't say out loud. If Thomas was coming back, he would have found them by now. Something had happened to him out there in that wilderness. Something that had left his wife and his unborn child stranded and all alone. "I'm truly sorry," Wade said, and he meant every word. Rebecca just nodded as tears rolled down her cheeks. She looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms, and her whole face changed from sorrow to a fierce kind of resolve. "I have to keep going for him. Whatever happened to Thomas, I cannot do a thing to change it, but I can make darn sure his son makes it." Wade felt that strange feeling in his chest again, like a door creaking open just a little wider. Rebecca had a strength that had nothing to do with muscle, and everything to do with the very heart of who she was. She had delivered a baby all by herself in the desert. She had looked death in the face with courage, and now she was ready to push forward no matter the heartbreak and the pain. "What are you going to name him?" Wade asked, giving a little nod toward the baby. Rebecca was quiet for a second, thinking it over. "James," she said at last, "after Thomas's father, James Thomas Garrett." Wade nodded. It was a good, solid name. He watched as Rebecca began to nurse the baby, then turned his gaze away to give her some privacy while still keeping a sharp eye on the desert around them. They were in a bad spot here, out in the open and worn out. But nothing bothered them besides the wind and the far-off cry of a hawk circling high above. They rested for a few hours, taking turns sleeping while the other one stood watch. When the worst of the midday heat had finally broken, they started moving again. Rebecca seemed to have a little more strength, though Wade could see the pain in every single move she made. Childbirth was a rough business even in the best of places, and Rebecca had gone through it with nothing but the hard ground and the help of a stranger. That night they made camp once more, and Wade cooked a simple supper of beans and dried meat over the campfire. Rebecca ate like she was starving, her body crying out for fuel to recover from everything it had been through. The baby, James, seemed healthy and strong, crying when he got hungry and sleeping soundly against his mother's chest for the rest of the time. "What were you doing out here?" Rebecca asked while they sat by the fire. "So far from any place. Just running supplies between Skidoo and the mining camps up north," Wade explained. "I have been doing this route for about a year now. The work pays steady and I don't mind the quiet." "You have family in Skidoo?" Rebecca asked. Wade shook his head. "No family to speak of. My folks passed on about 8 years ago. I have been on my own since that time." Rebecca was quiet for a bit, watching him in the flickering firelight. "That must get lonely." Wade just shrugged, not feeling comfortable with the pity he heard in her voice. "I am used to it." "That does not mean it is not lonely," Rebecca said, her voice soft. Wade didn't have a comeback for that. So he stood up and went to check on the horse, giving his hands something to do and giving himself a reason to look away from Rebecca's knowing gaze. She saw right through a man, understood things she shouldn't, and it made him feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the wide-open desert all around them. They finally reached the edge of Skidoo late the next afternoon. The town wasn't much, hardly more than a handful of buildings huddled around the mining operation that kept it alive. It had only popped up a few years before, when somebody struck gold in the hills, and most of the folks living there were rough men trying to make their fortune in this unforgiving country. But it had a doctor, a general store, and a boarding house run by a woman named Martha Chen, who was known for taking in strays and not asking too many questions. Wade led them, Martha's place, a solid-looking adobe house on the edge of town. Martha herself came to the door when he knocked. She was a short, sturdy woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes that sized up the whole situation in a single glance. "Wade Emerson," she said, her voice a mix of her Cantonese upbringing and long years of speaking English. "You've brought me something mighty interesting this time." "This here is Rebecca Garrett," Wade said. "She needs a place to rest and get her strength back. She gave birth 2 days ago out on the desert trail. I found her all alone." Martha's expression went from curious to deeply concerned in a heartbeat. She swung the door open wider and waved them on in. "Bring her inside, quickly now. You did what for her?" She aimed that last question at Wade as he helped Rebecca down off the horse. "I caught the baby," Wade said, plain and simple. Martha's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't ask any more questions. She just led them to a room in the back of the boarding house. It was small, but it was spotless, with a real bed, clean sheets, and a window that let in the light and the breeze. Wade helped Rebecca sit down on the edge of the bed, and Martha immediately started fussing over her, checking her temperature and looking over the baby with a well-practiced eye. "You did good work," Martha told Wade after a few minutes. "Mama and baby are both healthy, all things considered, but she needs plenty of rest, real food, and time to heal up." She turned to Rebecca. "You stay right here for as long as you need. No charge for the first week. After that, we can talk." "I can pay you," Rebecca said right away. "I have some money in my bag." Martha just waved a hand, dismissing it. "We will worry about all that later. Right now, you just rest." Wade began to back out toward the doorway, suddenly feeling out of place in this room that had become a woman's space. But Rebecca called out his name, stopping him in his tracks. "Will you come back?" she asked, and there was a fragile note in her voice that made his chest feel tight. "To check on us." "Yes," Wade said without even thinking, without wondering why the word came so easily. "I'll come back." He left them be and went to see to his horse, then walked over to the small room he rented for himself above the general store. It was a sparse place with just a bed, a chair, and a trunk for his things, but that was everything he needed. He had never once given a thought to how simple his life was, but now it felt as hollow as a dried-out gourd. Wade cleaned up and put on fresh clothes, then headed over to the saloon for a shot of whiskey and a hot plate of food. The whiskey bit all the way down, but it could not wash out the feeling of Rebecca's hand wrapped around his, or the memory of that baby sliding into his waiting hands, or the sound of his first cry cutting right through the quiet desert air. He walked back to Martha's boarding house the next morning, telling himself he was just checking on them, the same way he would check on a lame horse or a sick friend. But when Rebecca smiled at him from her bed, all propped up with pillows while the baby slept in a basket nearby, Wade felt another piece of that wall around his heart just crumble away. "How are you holding up?" he asked, feeling out of place just standing there in the doorway. "Better," Rebecca said. "Martha brought me some food and helped me wash up. It feels like a little piece of heaven to be sleeping in a real bed again." Her smile trembled just a bit. "Have you heard anything? About a wagon on the trail, or maybe someone asking about a lost man?" Wade just shook his head. He had asked around town the night before, quiet-like, but nobody had seen a busted wagon or a man looking for help. The desert held on to its secrets, and whatever became of Thomas Garrett was one of them. "I am truly sorry," Wade said again. Rebecca nodded, her eyes looking somewhere far away. I think I already knew even before you told me. I just felt it in my bones that he was gone. Is that strange? No, Wade said. I do not think that is strange at all. He came by every single day for the next week, bringing little things when he could. A small rattle he had whittled from a piece of wood for the baby, some fresh fruit he bought at the general store for Rebecca. Each time he stayed a little longer than the last, and their talk started to flow easier, getting deeper with each passing day. Rebecca told him all about growing up in Missouri and about following her folks out west after her daddy heard stories about gold and opportunity out in California. She talked about meeting Thomas and the simple life they had made for themselves, a life that was humble but full of happiness. Wade heard himself telling her stories in return, things he had not said out loud to anyone in years. He talked about his own folks and the farm they used to have, and the fever that took them both in the same week. He spoke of the long years he spent just drifting after that, never putting down roots, never letting anybody get close enough to matter. Why not? Rebecca asked him one afternoon while she was nursing little James, with a blanket draped over her shoulder for privacy. Why keep everyone so far away? Wade stayed quiet for a long while, just staring out the window at the dusty street. Because sooner or later, everybody leaves, he finally said. One way or another. It just seemed a whole lot easier not to give them the chance. That is not living, Wade, Rebecca said, her voice soft. That is just getting by. They are not the same thing. Wade did not have an answer for that, mostly because he had a sinking feeling she was right. He had just been getting by for 8 long years, moving from town to town like a ghost, never staying long enough to leave a mark or let one be left on him. He thought it was the safe thing to do. But sitting here in this little room with Rebecca and baby James, he started to wonder what he had really been protecting himself from, and if it had been worth the price. Just then, Martha came in with a tray of food, and the moment was broken. Wade got up to go. But as he got to the door, Rebecca called out his name. "Thank you," she said, and her green eyes were full of meaning. "For everything, for finding me, for helping me, and for keeping on coming back. I do not know what I would have done without you." "You would have been just fine," Wade said. "You are a lot stronger than you think." But as he walked away, he knew that was only half the truth. Rebecca was strong, no doubt about it, but everybody needs a hand sometimes. Everybody needs someone to reach out in the dark and pull them back to the light. He had done that for her. And in some strange way, she had done the very same thing for him, though he was just now starting to piece it all together. The days bled into weeks, and Wade's life fell into a whole new kind of rhythm. He still took jobs hauling supplies when they came up, but he started finding more reasons to stick around Skidoo, to check in on Rebecca and James, to help Martha fix things around the boarding house, just to be present in a way he had not been present anywhere for a long, long time. Rebecca got her strength back, and the color came back into her cheeks. She started moving with more confidence. James was doing great, getting fat and happy on his mother's milk. His little eyes started to follow things, and his tiny hands would swing at anything that came close. One evening, Martha pulled Wade aside in the hall right outside Rebecca's room. "You know, folks are talking," she said, straight to the point. "About what?" Wade asked, though he had a pretty good idea. "About you and Rebecca. About all the time you are spending over here. About what is going to happen when she is well enough to move on." Wade felt his jaw clench up. "We are just friends." Martha gave him a look that said she had heard that old line a time or two before and was not buying it. "She is a widow woman with a brand new baby and not much else. You are a single man with no one to answer to and a whole lot of interest, it seems. I am not passing judgment, Wade, but I am telling you to be sure about what you are doing. That woman has been through more than her share. She does not need any more heartache." Wade wanted to argue that he had no intention of causing Rebecca any pain. But Martha was already walking away, leaving him alone in the hallway with his thoughts all jumbled up. He did not know what he was doing, if he was being honest with himself. All he knew was that he could not make himself stay away, That any day he did not see Rebecca and James felt wrong, like a piece was missing. He went in to see them anyway, just like he planned, and found Rebecca sitting in the rocking chair near the window with James sound asleep in her arms. She looked up as he came in, and her smile lit up a warm place inside his chest. "I was hoping you would stop by tonight," she said. "I needed to talk to you about something." Wade took a seat in the chair across from her, feeling a little on edge all of a sudden. "What is on your mind?" "Martha says I'm well enough to travel soon," Rebecca said. "And I have been thinking about what comes next. I cannot go to my sister's in Barstow, not by myself with a newborn and no safe way to get there. And I cannot stay here forever living on Martha's kindness." "You could stay," Wade heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Here in Skidoo, I mean. Find some work, make a new life." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, just looking at him with those sharp green eyes that saw right through him. "Is that what you want, Wade? For me to stay?" Wade had to swallow hard. This was it, he knew. This was the moment he either stepped into something new and scary, or took a step back into that safe, lonely world he had lived in for so long. Martha's words were ringing in his head, warning him to be sure. But when he looked at Rebecca, at the hope and the fear mixed together on her face, he knew there was only one thing he could say. "Yes," he said, his voice coming out a little rough. "I want you to stay." "Why?" Rebecca asked. It was not a challenge, just a simple question from a woman who needed to understand. Wade got up and walked to the window, looking out at the sky as it started to get dark. "Because when I am with you, I feel like I am finally living, instead of just getting by. Because I care more about what happens to you and James than I have cared about anything in years. Because the thought of you leaving this town makes me feel how empty my life was before, and I did not even know it." He turned back to face her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Rebecca, and I do not have the first clue what to do about it." Rebecca's eyes went wide, and she just sat there for a long moment without saying a word. A wave of panic washed over Wade, a fear that he had said way too much, moved way too fast, and wrecked the sweet, fragile friendship they had built. But then Rebecca stood up, shifting James carefully in her arms, and walked right over to him. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it scares me half to death because Thomas has only been gone a month, and I feel so guilty for feeling this way. But I just cannot help it. Wade, you saved my life. You saved my son's life, and you keep showing up day after day, and I catch myself looking out the window for you, hoping you will come by and feeling my heart sink when you have to go." Wade reached out and gently touched her cheek, his rough fingers trembling just a little. "We do not have to rush a thing. We can take it as slow as you need, figure it out one day at a time." "I would like that," Rebecca said, leaning her face into his hand. "But I want you to know I'm sure about you, about this. I know it is awful fast. I know people will talk, but I'm sure." Wade felt a tight knot in his chest that he had been carrying for years finally start to come undone. He leaned down and kissed her on the forehead, a soft and simple kiss that was a promise of more when the time was right. "Stay in Skidoo," he said. "Let me help you get settled. Find a little place for you to live. Help out with James. Let me court you the right and proper way you deserve." Rebecca smiled, and tears started to shine in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to all of it." They just stood there together as the first stars started popping out in the night sky, with James sleeping peaceful as can be right between them. And for the first time in 8 long years of wandering, Wade felt like he was finally home. The next few months flew by in a whirlwind of good work and big changes. Martha had a small cottage right behind her place, that old boarding house she'd been using for storage. And Wade, he spent a good few weeks getting it squared away, making it a place where Rebecca and James could live right. He patched up the roof, put new glass in the broken windows, built them some furniture, and gave the walls a fresh coat of paint. Rebecca pitched in whenever she could, and between the two of them, they turned that forgotten building into a right cozy little home. Wade was real careful to court Rebecca properly, seeing as how she was still grieving and knowing how folks talk in a small town. He would bring her wildflowers he found growing out in the scrub, take her for walks through Skidoo when little James was sleeping sound in the sling she carried him in, and just sit with her on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing at all. They shared their hopes and their worries, the hurts from their pasts and the dreams for their future, and they slowly built a trust between them that was strong as an old oak. The folks in Skidoo, they watched with keen interest, but with a whole lot less judging than Wade had braced himself for. Martha, she made sure to spread the story of how Wade had found Rebecca and delivered her baby out on that desert trail. And that tale started to sound almost like a legend the more it got told. People just saw them as two survivors who had found each other when things were at their worst, and most everyone was willing to let them have their peace. James, he grew and got strong, and his little personality started to shine through. He was a happy baby, always ready with a smile and hardly ever fussed, and Wade found himself just plain smitten with the boy. He had never given much thought to children before, always figuring that part of life just was not in the cards for him. But holding that little boy and watching him discover the world, well, it filled Wade with a kind of joy he never knew a man could feel. One evening in early October, when the desert heat was finally breaking into something a man could stand, Wade and Rebecca sat on the porch of her little house, watching the sun paint the whole sky with streaks of orange and purple. James was asleep inside, and for once they had a quiet moment to themselves. "I've been doing some thinking," Wade said, and his voice was low and shaky, which was not like him at all. "About what?" Rebecca asked, though she had a look on her face that said she might already know. "About the future. About how I want my life to be." Wade reached for her hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of it. "I know we said we'd take things slow, and I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for. But, Rebecca, I just cannot picture a life without you and little James in it anymore. These last few months have been the best days I have ever known." Rebecca's eyes were shining when she looked at him. "They have been happy for me too, Wade. It has been hard sometimes because I am still mourning Thomas, and I reckon a part of me always will be. But happy, yes. You brought hope back into my life when I thought it was all gone for good." Wade took a deep breath and pulled a small box out of his pocket. He had spent a whole week's wages on what was inside, but it felt right, like it had to be done. "Rebecca Garrett, would you make me the proudest man alive and be my wife? I want to build a life with you, raise James as my own boy if you will have me. Maybe we can have more children, if that is something you would want. I want to see your face when I wake up, and be the last thing you see before you close your eyes at night, for all the rest of my days." Rebecca was crying by then, but she was smiling too, and her whole face was just radiant. "Yes," she said without even a pause. "Yes, Wade. I will marry you." Wade opened the box, and inside was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it. It was from around there and was nothing fancy, but it was beautiful in its own way. He slipped it on her finger, and she threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with a fire that set his head to spinning and his heart to pounding. They were married a month later, in a simple little service at the small church that looked after Skidoo and the mining camps nearby. Martha stood up as their witness, along with a few other friends they had made in town. Rebecca wore a new dress she had stitched up herself, a pale blue cotton that made her green eyes stand out, and Wade wore his best clothes, all cleaned and pressed. James, a stout 5 months old now, was held by Martha during the service, but he seemed to know something important was happening, taking everything in with his big, serious eyes. When the preacher said the words that made them man and wife, Wade kissed Rebecca with all the love he had in him, and their little group of friends clapped. It was not a big to-do, no grand party, but it was perfect just the same, in how simple and true it was. That night they moved into the cottage together. A real family, plain and simple. Wade had not lived with another soul since his folks passed, and settling in was both easier and tougher than he had figured. It was easier because being with Rebecca just felt as natural as breathing, like what he was always meant to do. It was harder because he had to learn how to share his space and make choices with another person, to think about what she needed and wanted right alongside his own. But they figured it out together, learning each other's ways and habits, building a life from the very start. Wade kept on with his supply runs, but he took on shorter routes so he could be home more often, not wanting to be away from his new family for too long. Rebecca took in sewing and patching work to help make ends meet, and they saved up what they could, planning for a future that seemed to get a little brighter every day. The first time James called him Papa, the boy was nearly a year old, and Wade felt his eyes well up something fierce at the sound. He never expected to feel such a powerful love for a child that was not his own flesh and blood. But James was his son in every single way that mattered, and Wade would have fought any man who tried to say different. One night in early 1886, as they were lying in bed together, Rebecca turned to Wade, looking a little nervous. "There is something I need to tell you." Wade's heart near jumped out of his chest, his mind going through all the possibilities. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," Rebecca said real quick. "At least I do not think so. Wade, I am pregnant." Wade just stared at her for a second, and it took a moment for her words to sink in. Then a grin spread clear across his face, big and real. "Are you sure?" "About as sure as I can be," Rebecca said. "I have been feeling the same as I did with James, and I'm late, and Martha says all the signs are pointing that way." Wade pulled her into his arms and held her close, his heart feeling so full he thought it might just bust. "That is wonderful news. That is the best news I have ever heard in my life." "You are not worried?" Rebecca asked, her voice kind of muffled against his chest. "About the cost? About how we will manage with two little ones?" "We will manage it," Wade said, firmly. "We will manage it the same way we have managed everything else that has come our way. Together. We will make it work, 'cause that is just what we do." Rebecca relaxed in his arms, and Wade held her all through the night, his mind already jumping ahead to what was coming. Another child, a brother or a sister for James. Another life they would bring into this world and raise up right together. It was scary and wonderful all at the same time. But Wade found he was not scared one bit. He had Rebecca, he had James, and soon they would have another little one joining their family. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, more than he ever thought was possible for a man like him, who had once been just drifting through life with no real purpose. The pregnancy went along smooth, and Rebecca just glowed, looking healthier and happier than ever. James, who was a toddler now, seemed to know something was about to change, getting more clingy and wanting to be held by both Wade and Rebecca. Wade added on to the cottage, building another little room that would be a nursery, working by the light of a lantern late into the night after he got back from his runs. The baby arrived in November of 1886. It was another hard birth, but it was nothing like that pure terror out on the desert trail. This time, Rebecca labored in their own bed with Wade right there beside her and Martha there to help, her sure and steady hands guiding them through it all. When their daughter came into the world with a healthy cry, Wade felt that same powerful awe he had felt when he held James for the first time, that feeling like he was watching a miracle unfold right before his eyes. They named her Sarah, and she had Wade's dark hair and her mama's green eyes. James, all of 18 months old now, was just taken with his new baby sister, always wanting to touch her real gentle and bring her his toys. Wade would look at his family and feel a contentment so deep it almost hurt. This life he had pieced together from nothing was now so full and rich it hardly seemed like it could be real. But it was real, solid as the ground beneath his feet. And Wade woke up every single morning thankful for it. He had been given a second chance at life that day. He heard Rebecca's scream cut across the desert silence, and he had not let it go to waste. He had made the choice to step up, to help, to care, and to love, and that one choice had changed his whole world. The years went on by, and each one brought its own troubles and its own joys. Wade saved enough money to buy a little patch of land outside Skidoo, and he built a real house there, solid and roomy, with plenty of space for their family to grow. They added a son, William, in 1888, and another girl, Clara, in 1890. The little cottage behind Martha's boarding house was rented out to someone else, but they still visited often, since Martha had become like a beloved grandmother to their children. Wade gave up the dangerous business of running supplies through the desert and instead started up his own freight business right there in Skidoo. He hired other fellas to make the runs while he managed things from town. It was steadier work and safer, and it meant he could get home every night for supper and be there to tuck his little ones into bed. James grew up to be a smart, lively boy with a love for horses, wanting to be a cowboy just like his papa. Wade taught him how to ride and how to look after the animals, showing him the value of hard work and a kind heart. He made certain James knew all about Thomas Garrett, his real father, by sharing the stories Rebecca had told him, so the boy would always understand his roots. But James called Wade Papa, and that was that. Wade loved that boy with the same fierce protectiveness he had for all his children. Sarah was a quieter soul than her brothers, gentle and always lost in a book. William was the wild card, forever finding his way into trouble and keeping Rebecca and Wade on their toes. As for Clara, she was still just a baby, her true spirit yet to show itself, but she was adored by her older brother and sisters, and absolutely spoiled by her parents. On those warm evenings, Wade would settle onto the porch of their house with Rebecca right beside him. They would watch their children playing in the yard as the sun bled across the desert sky. Sometimes his mind would drift back to that July day in 1885, to the scream that had yanked him from his path and changed the course of his life for good. He would think about the man he was back then, all alone and adrift, and the man he was now, surrounded by love, a family, and a real purpose. "What's on your mind?" Rebecca would ask, reading his face the way she had learned to over the years. "Just how lucky I am," Wade would answer, reaching for her hand. "How none of this would have ever happened if I had not been in that exact spot at that exact right moment." "I think about that sometimes too," Rebecca would say, her voice soft, "about how scared I was, how I was so sure I was going to die all alone out on that trail. And then you showed up like you were sent from heaven, and everything changed. We saved each other," Wade would say, and Rebecca would nod, resting her head on his shoulder. It was the honest truth. Wade had surely saved Rebecca and James that day on the desert trail, catching that baby and getting them both to safety. But Rebecca had saved Wade too. She pulled him right out of his loneliness and showed him what a life could be if you just let yourself open up to love and a real connection. They had built something beautiful together, something neither one of them could have ever managed on their own. The years kept on rolling by, and their children grew tall. James became a fine young man, and in time he started taking over parts of Wade's freight business. Sarah went and married a schoolteacher and moved to a town nearby, but she visited often, bringing her own growing family with her. William, to the surprise of just about everyone, finally settled down and became a rancher, showing a kind of steadiness that nobody ever expected from the wild child he used to be. And Clara, the baby of the family, grew up to be a nurse, dedicating her life to taking care of others. Her gentle heart found its perfect calling in her work. Wade and Rebecca grew old side by side, their hair turning to silver, their faces etched with the lines of a long life, but they were still as beautiful as ever to each other. They would sit on that same porch, now in a house that had soaked up decades of life and love, and watch their grandchildren run and play in the same yard their own children once did. "Do you have any regrets?" Rebecca asked him one evening, her hand still fitting into his like it was made to be there after all this time. Wade thought on it, truly considered her question. Had there been tough times? Yes, plenty of struggle and worry and fear. No doubt about it. But regrets? No, he said at last. Not a single one. Everything I have, everything we built together, it all started on the day I found you. That was the best moment of my whole life, even if neither of us knew it then. Rebecca smiled, that same smile that had captured Wade's heart from the very beginning. Mine, too. You gave me hope when I had none left. You gave James a father and me a partner, and from that we made this wonderful life. I would not change a single thing. They sat there as the stars began to pop out in the sky, the desert night turning cool and clear all around them. From inside the house they could hear the sounds of their family, their grown children and their families, all gathering for dinner like they did every Sunday. The laughter and chatter, the clink of plates and the patter of grandchildren's feet, the warm glow of lamplight spilling out from the windows. Wade Emerson had spent a good part of his life believing he was meant to be a loner, that things like connection and family were not written in his stars. But on a July day back in 1885, a woman's scream had shattered that belief and opened a door to a future he could have never dreamed up on his own. He had caught a baby out on a desert trail, and in that one moment, he had caught his entire future. He held it right there in his trembling hands and refused to ever let it go. Rebecca Garrett had been so certain she was going to die alone, that her baby would never draw his first breath, that her story was doomed to end in tragedy. But a cowboy had appeared right when she needed him the most. He helped her do the impossible, and then he stayed. Not just for a day or a week, but for a whole lifetime, building something solid and precious from what could have just been a fleeting moment. They had found one another in the worst possible situation you could imagine, had fallen in love slow and steady, and had created a family that would stretch on for generations. Their love story started with terror and pain, but it grew into something beautiful and strong, a true testament to the power of choosing to care, to help, and to stay. As the night got deeper and the family gathered inside, Wade and Rebecca finally stood up, their hands still joined, just as they had been for more than 30 years. They walked inside together, into the warmth and the light and the love they had made. And Wade sent up a quiet thank you to the heavens for the day his path crossed Rebecca's on that lonesome desert trail. Their story could have ended in so many different ways, but it did not. Instead, it became a story of survival and grit, of a love that came out of nowhere, and a family they chose to build, a story of two people who found each other at their lowest point and made something extraordinary from that chance meeting. It was a story they would tell their grandkids, and a story their grandkids would tell their own children. It was a legacy of love that all began with a scream in the desert and a cowboy who chose to answer the call. The desert had been a cruel place that day in 1885, brutal and harsh, and it seemed like it was made to break anything fragile. But it was also the backdrop for a miracle, the place where two lost souls found each other and learned that together they could get through anything. The same sun that beat down without mercy on the rocks and sand had also looked down upon the birth of a new life and the start of a love story that would last a lifetime. Years on, when Wade was an old man in his 70s, he would sometimes ride out to that spot on the trail, the place where he had first found Rebecca. There was no marker there, nothing to set it apart from the miles and miles of desert all around it. But he always knew exactly where it was. He would stand there, his old buckskin mare long gone and replaced by younger horses. But his love for the quiet of the desert was unchanged, and he would remember. He would remember the sound of her scream, the pure terror in her eyes, the surprising weight of little James in his hands as he came into the world. He would remember that long ride back to Skidoo with Rebecca swaying in the saddle, both of them worn down to the bone, but neither of them willing to give up. He would remember the first time she really smiled at him, the first time he took her hand, the first time he told her he loved her. And he would remember the life they put together, piece by piece and day by day, turning what should have been a tragedy into a victory. James, now a middle-aged man with kids of his own, ran the freight business with a sharp mind and a steady hand. Sarah, William, and Clara were all grown and successful and happy, and each one of them carried the legacy of parents who had loved them something fierce and raised them right. On one of those rides, Rebecca came with him, riding side saddle despite her age, her gray hair tucked neatly under a bonnet, but her green eyes still sharp and full of life. They stood together at that spot, and Wade slipped his arm around her waist. "It's hard to believe it all started right here," he said, his voice low. "Is it?" Rebecca asked, looking up at him with a little smile. "I think if I had to pick a place for my whole life to change, the desert seems right. Nothing out here is gentle or easy. To survive, you need strength and grit and a will to fight. We both had that, Wade. We still do." Wade kissed the top of her head, taking in the familiar smell of her hair. "I love you, Rebecca Emerson. I think I've loved you since the day I found you here, even though I was too thick-headed to know it yet." "I love you too," Rebecca said, leaning against him. "Thank you for stopping when you heard me scream. Thank you for not just riding on by." "I never could have ridden away," Wade said. "Not from you. Not from the life we were always meant to build together." They stood there for a while longer. Two old folks surrounded by the vast, empty quiet of the Mojave Desert, the very place that had nearly been the end of them but instead brought them together. Then they climbed back up on their horses and rode for home, back to the house filled to the rafters with memories and the family they had made, back to the life that had started with a scream and a stranger's kindness, and had grown into something neither of them could have ever dreamed of, but that both of them cherished more than anything. The sun set at their backs as they rode, painting the desert in shades of gold. And gold, Wade marveled at the wild paths a man's life could follow. How one ordinary supply run could become the single most important journey he ever took. How a simple decision to help a stranger could lead to a lifetime overflowing with joy. How love could take root in the harshest of places and grow strong enough to stand against any storm. When they finally pulled up to the homestead, their children were there waiting, along with a whole passel of grandkids and even a few great-grandkids. The littlest ones were too small to grasp it all, but they were already part of the family legacy Wade and Rebecca had built from scratch. A big party was planned, a celebration for 40 years of being married. Not that Wade needed a party to recall the date or the words they had promised each other in that little church back in Skidoo. As the evening settled in and the family gathered close, one of the grandkids asked Wade to tell the story again, the one they all knew by heart but never got tired of hearing. Wade looked over at Rebecca, and she gave him a warm, knowing smile. And so he began. "It was back in July of 1885, he said, his voice still steady and clear despite the years. "I was heading north through the desert, hauling supplies to a mining camp, when I heard a cry that changed my whole world forever. The family made themselves comfortable, the children sitting cross-legged on the floor, while the grown-ups found chairs or leaned against the walls. Wade told them about finding Rebecca all alone on that trail, about catching little James as he came into the world, and about the long, hard journey back to Skidoo. He spoke of how their love grew slow and steady like a deep river. He talked about building a life piece by piece, and about choosing day after day to stay and to fight and to love, even when the world made it hard. When he was done, the room was quiet for a heartbeat, and then one person started to clap. Soon the whole family was applauding, and Wade felt a familiar burn behind his eyes. This was his true legacy, he knew. It wasn't the business he'd built or the house that stood around them. It was this family, these wonderful people who were here only because he'd made the choice to stop when he heard a woman in trouble out in the middle of nowhere. Rebecca moved to his side, and their children circled around them, a living, breathing testament to the power of love and sheer grit. James, now 40 years old with streaks of silver in his dark hair, gently placed a hand on Wade's shoulder. "Thank you, Papa," he said, his voice low and full of feeling, "for saving my mama, for choosing us, and for being the best father a man could ever hope for." Wade pulled him into a tight embrace. This son who had been born right into his own hands. The boy he had raised and loved with every fiber of his being, just like all his other children. "Thank you for letting me be your father," Wade said, his voice thick with emotion. "It has been the greatest honor of my entire life." The celebration went on late into the night, but one by one, everyone eventually headed home or found a spare bed inside the big house. Wade and Rebecca went to their own bedroom, the very same room they had shared for decades, and got ready for sleep with the quiet, easy rhythm of a lifetime spent together. 40 years, Rebecca said, sitting at her vanity and brushing out her long silver hair. "Sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday, and other times it feels like a whole eternity." "It's both," Wade agreed, pulling on his nightshirt. "It surely has been both." They got into bed, and Rebecca settled against Wade's chest, a place she had fit perfectly for 40 years. His arm wrapped around her on instinct, holding her safe and close, and they lay there for a spell in that comfortable silence. "Do you think we would have found happiness?" Rebecca asked out of the blue. "If we'd never crossed paths, if some other fella had found me that day, or if nobody had, and somehow James and I made it through on our own." Wade took his time thinking on the question. "I reckon you would have found a way to be happy," he said at last. "You're strong enough to carve out a good life no matter what. But me, I don't think I would have. I think I would have just kept on drifting, staying walled off from everyone until I was nothing but a bitter old man with empty hands and an emptier heart." "I am so glad it didn't turn out that way," Rebecca whispered. "Me too, darling," Wade said, and he kissed her on the forehead. "Me too." They fell asleep just like that, wrapped up in each other's arms. And if they dreamed of dusty desert trails and brand new beginnings, of cries that were answered and babies that were caught, of two lives woven together and a love that never faded. Wade Emerson lived a long life, to the age of 79, and Rebecca lived to be 77. They were laid to rest side by side in the Skidoo Cemetery, under a single headstone that said it all, together, forever. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren came for the funerals, grieving their loss, but also celebrating the two incredible lives they had lived. James, the baby Wade had caught on that desert trail, gave the eulogy for both his parents. He spoke through his tears about their boundless courage, their deep love, and their solid, unwavering devotion to their family. He told the story one last time, the story of the cowboy and the woman giving birth all alone, about how they rescued each other and built something truly beautiful out of the ashes of a terrible situation. The legacy of Wade and Rebecca Emerson continued on through their family, through the businesses they started, and through all the people whose lives they had touched. But more than anything, their legacy was the story itself. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important things in life happen because we make a choice to stop, to help, to show a little kindness to someone we don't even know. In the end, it all circled back to that one single choice Wade made on a hot July day in 1885, when he heard a scream echo across the desert. He could have just kept on riding. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that he had a schedule to keep and places to be. But he didn't. He stopped. He helped. And by doing that, he found everything in the world he never even knew he was searching for. Their story became a piece of the folklore of Skidoo and the desert all around it. It was told and retold so many times that it started to sound like a tall tale. But at its heart, the simple truth of it never changed. A truth that new generations would remember and pass on down the line. It was a testament to the power of compassion and the miraculous ways that lives can cross paths and be changed forever in one single defining moment. The stretch of desert trail where Rebecca gave birth was eventually reclaimed by the wilderness, buried by time and the blowing sands. Skidoo itself slowly withered away after the gold ran out and folks moved on to chase other dreams. But the story lived on, carried in the hearts of those who remembered. It was a beacon of hope that served to remind anyone who heard it that miracles can happen in the most unexpected of places, and that love can blossom even in the driest, harshest desert if you are just brave enough to reach out and take a chance on it.